Senator Wu.
To the witnesses. Ms. Bandali, you mentioned that there are ambiguities in the sanctions regime and gave one example of whether it's permissible to continue with a contract that's already in place. I wonder if you could give us other examples of ambiguities that could be cleared up with proper guidance, and perhaps our other witness might also want to chime in with his list of examples of ambiguities.
Certainly. Thank you, Senator. The example that I gave of the contract is the kind of issue where if two parties to a contract disagree on the interpretation of sanctions, then one party may be claiming that it's a force majeure event that justifies them not participating in the activity, and the other might disagree. So that was more about the consequences of ambiguity. But let me give you some examples. So one of the most common provisions that you see in many different regulations under our CIMA, it's that Canadians cannot deal in property that is owned, held, or controlled on or on behalf of a listed person. So when you think about that word control, what does control mean? What factors are relevant? Does control strictly refer to legal control, such as holding majority voting rights? Or are we talking about influence in decision-making that might be control in fact or de facto control? Or to give an even more concrete example, when you think about the scope of the dealing provision, so say you have a Canadian citizen who sits on the board of directors of a foreign company. That foreign company isn't subject to Canadian law. So say they're doing something that is dealing in the property of a listed person. What are the obligations of that Canadian citizen director? Do our sanctions law require her to recuse herself from decisions related to that, transaction that might be problematic if that foreign company were Canadian, but they're not? Or does she actually have to resign from the board? And if she stays on the board, is her presence on the board or involvement in the dealing facilitating an offense? Or is it not facilitation? Because the underlying transaction that the foreign entity is involved in is fine because that foreign entity isn't subject to the jurisdiction of Canadian law. So those are some of the issues, but Mr. Boscariol may have other examples as well.
Yeah, I mean, those are ones that are at the top of our list in terms of what we're dealing with our clients. In particular, when you look at ownership, what do you do with an entity that is 100% owned by someone that is listed under the sanctions, or maybe only 75% owned, or 50% owned, or minority owned? That question comes up constantly, and our allies have issued very explicit guidance on what to do when the entity you're dealing with is 50% or more owned by someone who's on the list. To go to Ms. Bandali's point about control, our allies, particularly the EU and the UK, have given great guidance on how you interpret control in those in various situations. We have none of that in Canada. And so, for example, when Roman Abramovich was listed as a sanctioned oligarch under Canada's Russia sanctions, a lot of questions came up as to what we do with the companies that are owned by Roman Abramovich. And there are some companies in Canada owned by Roman Abramovich. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came out very helpfully and said, you don't have to worry about the fact that Abramovich owns 30% of one of our big steelmakers in Western Canada. That does not mean you are prohibited from dealing with that steelmaker. Now, that was very helpful in those circumstances, but that's not happening in every situation. And to have guidance like that would really reduce the questions Canadian companies have about complying with these measures.